Hi, everyone. This is Bill Owen, back with another podcast as we reach back into the depths of time for the fun things. Comic strips, radio, the movie serials, early television, the great literature of that era, the many motion picture stars and great comedians. Oh, what an era. What an era it was. And the subject today is comic strips to radio. What do I mean by that? Well, a lot of the popular comic strips of the 30s and 40s appeared on network radio. That was a thrill for youngsters like myself, my comrades. Many of the popular comic strips, in fact, served as a basis for successful shows on radio, with the leading characters transferred right onto the air. So sometimes the same plot lines were applied, and other times had nothing to do with the original. For example, Chester Gould told me that he had no connection really with the radio broadcast. Chester Gould, speaking of Chester Gould, the creator of Dick Tracy, I became a corresponding buddy of his. I sent him a letter one time praising one of his Sunday comics, in which he had the Crime Stoppers notebook, and he made a reference to not having a sign outside your window saying "No guns here," because that was like a flashing red light inviting burglars, so on. So he answered me with a postcard. I have that hanging up in my living room to this day. A wonderful answer from Chester Gould. I called him once on the phone, and we corresponded by mail a couple of other times. But anyway, that's my connection with Chester Gould, who was one of my real heroes of life. Oh, absolutely. So Dick Tracy was one of the foremost of the comic strips that made the transition to radio. Blondie, with the same people, Arthur Lake particularly, playing the role of Dagwood. Bringing Up Father, better known as Maggie and Jiggs. One of the biggest of all the radio programs of that era was Buck Rogers in the 25th Century A.D. He was also big in the serials, but primarily he was big on radio and the comic strips. And his counterpart, Flash Gordon, was not as big on radio, but bigger in the movie serials, as you may remember. Both very, very huge in the comic world. How about Don Winslow of the Navy? Remember that one? And Gasoline Alley, that's an interesting story. Gasoline Alley is the only major comic strip that actually kept track of the ages of all the participants in the strip. They marked birthdays, and they were accurate. And Skeezix was not in the original drawings of Gasoline Alley. In fact, the strip became known as Skeezix later. But he was a newborn babe left on Walt Wallet's and Blossom Wallet's doorstep, and he raised Skeezix and his little brother Corky. It was Skippy. I remember Skippy from way, way back in the comic strips. One little sequence had one of Skippy's friends saying, "Oh, things are terrible today. It's awful." And he said, "Why? What's so awful?" He says, "I'm not only broke, but nobody owes me anything." Well, I've often thought about that philosophy. Interesting. The Gumps with "Oh, men," he'd always shout to his wife, Andy Gump. Benjamin, or Bim, his rich uncle, was on there, of course. And Lil Abner, John Hodiak. What a great character actor he turned out to be on radio. And he captured Lil Abner perfectly. Perhaps the biggest of all the radio shows coming out of the comic strips was Little Orphan Annie. Oh, what else? There was Mr. and Mrs., there was Popeye the Sailor was a big one, Red Ryder, Regular Fellows, Smilin' Jack, Superman, of course, Terry and the Pirates, big in the comic strips, big on radio, big in the movie serials. And that was drawn by, let me think of his name now, Milton Caniff. And he didn't enjoy what the Chicago Tribune Daily News Syndicate did to him, because he created the strip, drove it to success, and he wanted a piece of the action. They said, no, you just a cartoonist, you work for us. So he dropped it, turned it over to George Wonder, and that strip became just about as big as ever. But he went on to Steve Canyon, and Steve Canyon became a huge comic strip for Milton Caniff. There was Tilly the Toiler, the timid soul. Harold Teen. Harold Teen. Oh, I remember all those wonderful characters. The Shadow, Pop Jenks in the Sugar Bowl. And let's see, what were some of the famous gags I remember from Harold Teen? Speaking of the gags from Harold Teen, I remember one heard on radio. I don't know why I remember it. It's not that funny, really, admittedly, but I remember he said, "Where were you bred, you crumb?" Oh, that's low class humor, but it's memorable. It stayed with me all those years. Just like a gag I remember Jerry Colonna pulled on Bob Hope one time, decades and decades ago, literally. And Hope was saying to Colonna, he said, "What are you doing, Colonna?" He says, "Hope, I'm building a bridge from New York to London." And Bob Hope says, "Colonna, you can't build a bridge from New York to London." And Colonna says, "You can't? Tear it down, fellas." Great memories of those days. We're speaking of Dick Tracy. He was noted for the terrible endings of some of his notorious criminals, and also for the great characterizations. Oh, there were so many and some of them had their names from words spelled backwards. For example, Yellow was Wally. Wally spelled backwards. Wally was the criminal. And one of the most notorious, the Blank, who was also featured in one of the Dick Tracy movies, feature movies. The Blank was Frank Redrum, and you realize Redrum backwards was murder. But what great names, what great appellations he gave to these characters. I remember Boris Arson. Doesn't that just sound, with all apologies to people named Boris Arson just sounds like a criminal name to me. And his sister Zora, who was equally evil. Oh, who else do we have in those days? We had Cut and Muscle Feynman, the Feynman brothers, and their mother Ma, who was also quite a notorious criminal. And we had, let me think now, Little Face Finney. He actually had a little face in the cartoon strip. And there was BB Eyes. There was Flat Top. I think, and I don't just think, I know Chester Gould said that his favorite character of all the villains was Flat Top. And then there was a son of Flat Top. There was 88 Keys. And that was always the way I remembered how many keys, black and white keys, there are on a piano. I think it's 52 versus 36 for a total of 88. 88 keys. There was Prune Face and later Mrs. Prune Face. Oh, another great criminal was Lips Manless. Great criminal, that's kind of a contradiction, an oxymoron, isn't it? But Lips Manless was a terrible hoodlum, a terrible thug. It ran a gang who was notorious. But Dick Tracy managed to make him over, had him shave his mustache. I don't know why that made him a better person, but bought him new clothes and renamed him Bob Honor. And Bob ended up working with the police instead of against them. There was the little girl Sparkle Plenty, of course, coming out of B.O. Plenty. That's when, in the 40s, the strip began to take a little bit of a satiric turn instead of focusing on the horrible criminals of that era, mostly inspired by Chicago gangs. He had characters like Gertrude Gertie. The Mole came along. Remember the Mole? Notorious. He had a face something like a mole. There was Carps, apparently based on the name of Alvin Karpis, another notorious criminal of that era. I remember Larceny Lou. How's that for a great name? There was Shaky. He was a real bad guy. Measles. We had Nat the Fur King. We had Stooge Viller, one of the early criminals. What a bunch of wonderful characters. Oh, Yogi Yama. Remember there was Mama and Jerome. And Diet Smith was a good guy. And there was Breathless Mahoney. And in the good cast, of course, Pat Patton was his assistant for so many years. And his son Junior, and then there was Tess Trueheart, who became his wife eventually. Oh, so many wonderful characters' names to think back over the years. Well, oh yeah, Pear Shape. We can't forget Pear Shape. Self-descriptive, isn't it? Oh, what memories we have of the great comic strips and the great characters, many of which ended up on radio. Oh, I'm still thinking of names before I sign off. Stud Bronson, and there was Shoulders, and there was Gargles, Doc Hump. Mary Steele was one of the good people, and she was in many, many of the comic strips. Well, we look back now at Dick Tracy fondly. We look back at Gasoline Alley, Popeye, Blondie, Little Orphan Annie. And we'll talk about things like this in the future. This is Bill Owen signing off for today.